Here's a look at the innards in the base of the camera here. Here you see the little cocking piece that's driven by this piece in the two holes there coupled to the shutter and cock the shutter. At the back of it you can see this pin on the end of the arm. That locks the capping plate up in position when the shutter's cocked. So its start position is there, and as it cocks it swings around and blocks the action of that. But this stuff down in here, this lever which couples through here, what do? Well, this is where the shutter's released by the shutter release button down here, and that automatically releases the mirror action at the same time. But as you can see, it's coupled through to this arm here, and this arm is what fires the shutter itself. Over here it releases the shutter. So this screw that you've got here, that's for adjusting the timing, so that as the mirror releases, the shutter is released at the correct point after the fact, after the mirror has lifted up out of the way. And this little disc here, and this thing here, well, that's coupled to the film advance, so that as the film advance is turned, you can see that that cutout rotates and allows this to swing all the way through, and actually allows the shutter to release, and blocks the action of the shutter release if the shutter's not in the fully wound on cocked position. So that's what all this is about. And all of that hides under this cover plate, which is held down with a screw at this point. That nut is slackened off and this tab slides underneath it. Now this was slightly bent on this camera, and the mirror or the capping plate was actually rubbing on here and it wasn't moving smoothly. So I've had to push that down a little bit to make sure there's sufficient clearance there. But that's what this thing is all about. Now that appears to me that that's all working correctly there. The adjustment that you make here, the access for that, is done from the back of the camera. This little screw here is just a plug. It's not actually in the plane of the film. The film only runs from this point to here. This is below the level of the film. But that screw head, you back that little grub screw out and it gives you access with a fine screwdriver to this screw here in order to make your adjustments for the timing of the release of the shutter. So I thought I'd show you that because it took me a little time to puzzle out how that all worked. By putting these pieces back in place, I've lubricated these parts with some molybdenum paste. In the slot here, on those surfaces, I touched these wheels here, but they spin on their axles, so they're not a great friction causing problem. This piece goes in here, and it couples to that little wheel that cocks the shutter. So it should be at that end of its travel. There's a little bit of play there, hardly any play at all. This piece, I've given this a wipe on the underside with some molybdenum paste. That just fits over there like that. You see that this arm moves freely past the end here. And there are 3 screws that hold this in position. When you're putting that piece in place, you need to take care that this wire in particular is not jammed in here and causing problems, because otherwise it'll get caught and you're likely to end up not being able to pull it through far enough to get it soldered up to the flash switch connection. So I'll get these 3 screws in position. I'm struck by the differences between this Paxette Reflex using the Compur reflex shutter and the Besomatics or the Retina reflexes using the same shutter. And with the Braun camera, they were very clever with their simplicity. There is no more moving parts than they absolutely needed to do the job, and it does it reasonably well. It doesn't do it wonderfully, but it does do it reasonably well. The cameras, when they were new, probably worked quite well. I'm not sure you could say the same about that now. They rely a little bit on good luck, I would imagine, and that things happen smoothly by themselves. Alright, so that's back in place. I've got my return spring set here. This little finger goes in here, and it must hook under that latch. We have our E clip or C clip here. Pop that in place. Now in theory the shutter should work. I think that sounds very promising indeed. I'm pleased with that. So what I'm going to do is just open the back of the camera, look through the back, out the window, and make sure that I do see the full aperture of the shutter exposed at all times. If that was on a 30th of a second, there was certainly no problem. I'll try it on a 500. And what I'm concerned about is if there's insufficient delay between the mirror rising, or the capping plate rising, and the shutter releasing to make the exposure, the capping plate may only be halfway up and you'll end up with a badly exposed film. But no, this is great. This is all working perfectly. If I'd needed to make an adjustment, it would have been made here. I would have removed that tiny little plug, put a fine screwdriver down there and adjusted that screw in order to change the point at which the shutter released after the mirror had released. Well, so far so good with this. I think the next task here is probably to put the flash sync back in place and close up the base of the camera. I think for convenience I will solder my wires on first and then screw the switch down into position. It'll make it easier for me to get these wires in where I want them, and then I've only got to put the 2 screws in and we should be good to go. And this wire, once it's all in place, I'll put a dab of adhesive here and here, as it had in this case, and that'll stop that from flapping about. Looking at the cutouts around here, it looks to me almost certainly the wire was intended to rise at this point, come around that loop, travel under that plate, come around that loop, travel under that plate, and onwards. But I don't see how you'd get the wire around that point. So that might have been what was intended when the camera was designed, but for one reason or another it didn't work out in practice because there's no easy loop through underneath that point. Alright, never mind. I'll solder these wires on and come back and put this in the shutter. Well, the flash wires are all soldered back in place. The switch is screwed back down to the bracket. everything's looking pretty good here. I'll just check my screws. I'll apply a little drop of adhesive here, just keeping that wire from flapping about. And apart from that, I can put the base plate back on the camera. Turn my attention to the top after that. You can see I've applied a couple of blobs of adhesive there. I'll just leave that to set up and put my base plate in position. Well, I just made a tactical error. I need to put this shaft back in for the coupling. But it can't be done with the shutter mounted to the body. So I've got the base plate back off. I'll have to disconnect my switch, unsolder the wires, take the shutter back off the front and put things back together in the right order. Well, as you can see, I got everything back in place. Now the control knob here will turn the aperture settings. It also couples through to this wheel, couples to this shaft here, and this shaft will control the meter. And so your meter is coupled to your shutter. At least that's the theory. I've popped the prism back in place, and the last thing to be dealt with here really is the meter. And the meter's got a problem, so I better deal with that. I noticed my frame counter disc here has been pushed out of shape. It's no longer flat. It must have hit the table at some stage. Let's see if I can straighten that up a bit. But the main thing is we have a shutter that works reliably. Looking through the viewfinder, everything looks good. When the lens is set the infinity position, an infinity target looks just right in the finder. Of course, I haven't checked it at the film plane to make sure that the things were done properly the last time this was serviced, but we'll assume for the moment that they were. Also, on this little piece of paper here, 1st of the 6th, 60. So it looks like 1st of June 1960 that camera was first assembled. The prism here, as you can see, has been glued in there. I don't know why anyone did that. It's also got black tape and all sorts of other stuff over it, which I am not going to disturb in the slightest. I can guarantee from all the things that have been done there that I'd end up with an absolutely ruined prism if I tried taking that apart. But the finder is comparatively clear, so it shouldn't give me any problems, or anyone else any problems for that matter. So, well on the way with this now. Got to do that meter next. So what's wrong with the meter? Well, apart from the wire here having parted company where it's soldered on the back of the cell, which isn't a great look, this setting dial at the top is not right. That ASA scale should be staying fixed, and as I move the pointer around I should change my apparent film speed, but that's not what's happening. So this has been mucked up in some fashion, and I'll have to find out how. Really, I want to take the top off this meter to see what's there. The coupling lever on the side here that couples to the camera and the follower needle, they work fine. It's just the top here. But I don't know how that top's held into that case. There are 2 screws visible at the base, but for all I know they hold the movement into the case, and I really don't want to disturb that unless I have to. So here, this sort of business, that plastic there, you can see the discoloration around there, that's solvent damage. That's where someone's been splashing solvent around on the camera, presumably in an effort to clean something, and it's affected the plastic. It's the same sort of damage that was visible on that flash switch at the base of the camera. Just somebody being heavy-handed with an inappropriate solvent around the plastic. A lot of these old plastics are like a styrene. They'll melt with just about anything. And particularly if it's clear like a window like that, they're completely ruined if you get a solvent near them. So this top, I don't know what I'm doing with that yet. I'm going to have to investigate. It's possible that this top section is glued on here and it'll prise straight up. I don't know whether this centrepiece here screws in. That's also a possibility. And I don't know whether the centre of this disc here is actually glued in place and it covers a screw. So a bit of investigation work needs to be done. Well, that was not a screw, it's a pin, and it was just glued in there. So that's a surprise. Let's see if this top will come off now. It doesn't appear that it will. I'll try prising that up. No, that's not going to lift off. I can just tell it's not looking hopeful at all. So this was just a decorative feature, this little piece in the middle. I'll try removing it at this point. It's not looking enthusiastic to move either. I don't really have any point of reference for this meter. I think these two screws at the side here just hold this bracket on. If it's, well, I've already seen solvent damage over here. It's quite possible that solvent got underneath here and effectively melted the plastic dial to this top piece. That's what's preventing it from turning. Well, with a bit more pushing and shoving, this thing started to actually work. And I can set the film speed now. Oh, that's useful. I'm still not sure what the secret was. Well, the saga of the Paxette Reflex Automatic continues. So the body's still sitting here waiting to have its top mated to it. Here I've just got the meter sitting back in the top housing. You can see I've resoldered the wires. The wire is very stiff. That plastic is hardened up over time, which the inflexibility of that plastic is what's led to the problems with the cable coming off here, the wire pulling off. It's just doesn't want to behave itself. That's okay. I've got my wire soldered back in place. I fixed my wire to the back here with some adhesive, and you can see I've reinforced it with some tape. So I'm not expecting that cable to cause me any problems by coming adrift. But the meter itself, what do we know about that? The secret of the meter. Well, this dial you see at the top, the one with the knobs that you can turn to set your film speed, that's intended to rotate. It couples to a cam inside underneath this top, so that as you turn it, it changes the position of that follower needle. I'm holding this tab on the base of the meter here as though it was being held in position by the camera mechanism. If I can get this thing to position correctly so you can see it. Here we can see the red pointer. As I move this to change the film speed, you'll see that it moves the red pointer to compensate for that change in film speed. So, our silver dial here at the top that we set things with, that is the thing that couples to the mechanism of the meter and changes the position of the follower needle, which allows you to see what your setting actually is. But underneath that silver dial, the black dial with the speed numbers, the film speed numbers on there, that was supposed to be fixed to the top of the meter housing. It wasn't supposed to rotate at all. The gunk and filth that was stuck under the silver plate had glued this to the black plate underneath effectively. So as you moved this, it moved the black plate. Now how that black plate was fixed to the meter, I've got no idea, because I can't get down into those things without the risk of breaking something seriously. It was either staked in place, it may have had a little tab that was folded into a hole or something like that prevented it from rotating, or it may simply have been glued in position on the top of the meter housing so that it stayed where it was put. So what did I do? Well, all of this took place with this chrome ring off the top of the camera, but basically I lifted both the black and the silver rings up slightly above the meter and slid some adhesive under there on the blade of the scalpel below the black disc on both sides, so that as that released back down, that glue would then hold that black disc in position where it was supposed to be. And so the next question is, how do I know where it was supposed to be? Well, fortunately, I had the other Paxette Reflex Automatic to go from, and I could tell that in that case, DIN 18 pointed along the midline of the camera, and so that's where I set that disc. And since it seems to work well on the other camera, and that black disc doesn't rotate on the other camera, I'm assuming that that'll work well in this case too. So now, the task is to fit my top cover back to the body, which means I've got to remove the meter again, which is done simply by removing this chrome trim at the top here, and that's just sitting in position because the two little grub screws that hold it in position, one was completely missing and the other one was not an original. It stuck out the side. It's supposed to be flush with the housing. So at the moment this is just clipped on. Now that doesn't appear to be a problem because it's fixed fairly firmly, and it's fixed fairly firmly because the camera has been dropped at some stage and there's a dent. This chrome ring was pushed out of shape. Whether that contributed to the stiffness in the moving dials or had anything to do with that black ring breaking away from the meter, that black plate with the numbers on, I don't know. And I don't really care, to tell the truth. The main thing here is to get this camera back in working condition. I'm not going to find original new replacement parts anywhere, so it doesn't really matter. So if I can remove this chrome ring again, which is just simply pried off with my finger there, there's a screw in the end housing here which is locating that meter in the top housing. I'll remove that screw and pop the meter down out of the top cover, hopefully not breaking my wire in the process, and fit the meter to the camera body. Sounds simple in theory. I think you can see just how inflexible that wire is because it doesn't want to move anything. I'm going to have all this propped up on something while I'm trying to get the meter in the camera body, I think. In the camera body, well, here we are, and the meter slides in here and is fixed with a screw at this point and this point. The meter coupling happens down here with this little piece, and you can probably see, I'm sure you can see there, the pin sticking out the side. That little pin couples to the arm on the base of the meter. I'll remove that pin while I'm fitting the meter in place and then connect it, put it back in place so that it contacts the arm on the bottom of the meter. I'll show you the base of the meter again. This is the arm that I'm speaking of. You can see it moves. It's got a little cutout under here which couples with that pin, and it's pulled forward by that pin, and that changes the setting of the follower needle on that meter according to what aperture and shutter speed you're currently rotating things towards. I'll remove that tiny pin. This is potentially one of the most fragile parts of the camera, and you'll see why. This is the pin, and we have just the shaft sticking out at one end, which doesn't even look to be fairly centered on that. So how they made this thing, I don't know. Normally you'd expect that to be made out of one thing. They'd started with the threaded rod, or they'd formed the thread, and then they put this into a collet and turned that off, the thread away to leave that shaft there. But whatever it is, it's small and it's delicate, and I don't want to break it. See if I can get my meter positioned in here. Because of the inflexibility of that wire, I'm having to be very cautious about how I go about doing this. Oh, that block's stopping this moving into position. Now I've got to flip this over on the bench without disturbing too much. And do the same on this side. I should have removed this eyepiece. It's preventing me positioning my top cover comfortably. That's better. So I need, oh, that was great. Let's not do that again. So I need this hole lined up. Okay, got that done up. Let's tighten it. Flip the camera back. Check that the other one's tight. Check that my meter still responds to light. I don't think you can see that meter needle in there. But it is working. Next I've got to get that little tiny pin back in position in the correct place. Of course we won't know it's in the correct place until I've got it back in position and see how the meter responds. Here is the tab on the meter, and here is the block that the pin goes through to connect to that tab. Now, in order to make this as stress-free as possible, I want this block at this end of that piece there. See if I can fit this top cover temporarily. I want access to the setting wheel so that I can move the settings here. Which way do I need to go? This way. That might be far enough. See if I can get that screw just started. And then hook the meter coupling into place behind it. That's as far as that's going to go. That's it, I think, coupled there. I'll put the top cover back on and hopefully we'll be able to see what the meter does. I don't know whether it's going to even be vaguely accurate. I haven't had any chance to test things like that before. So now I'll set my film speed to something vaguely useful. Just trying to think what I normally set these things to. I've got a calibrated light source on my shutter tester, and normally I set that at ASA 50 on that one. Normally I set my shutter speed to 125th, and I'll go and test that and see what it looks like. Hopefully I'm within a stop or two and we can come back and make adjustments. Well, that was not a resounding success. There's a break in the wire somewhere between my cell and my meter. And if I hold things at just the right angle, the meter will function. And I'm talking about the top housing, not the meter itself. So somewhere, as the wire twists, it's either shorting out or the wire's broken. But it means that I'm going to have to replace the wire from the cell through to the meter here. I think it's at the cell end, but it could be anywhere along that length. That's a shame, but at least I'll be replacing it with a decent piece of wire, I suppose. I think my problem lies with my earth wire or bare wire at this end. I'm going to clean away all the helpful adhesive and stuff that I've put there, and I'll connect a nice 2-core wire from there up to the meter at the top, where we have the same 2 types of wire, one uninsulated and one insulated. And I'll cut those back fairly neat too, and I'll use a little bit of heat shrink tubing around where the joins will be. So it'll be a bit tidier. This wire, the insulation is just very inflexible, and the outer insulation, well, that's just like concrete. I think it just broke just from flexing it or trying to flex it back into place. Well, things were going fairly smoothly until I dropped a blob of solder onto the nice acrylic top of the meter window there. So I've scraped that solder back out of there. Basically it had melted a nice big pit into it. I've scraped that back fairly level with a nice sharp scalpel blade, and I'm going to attempt to clean that area up with some Perspex polish to see if I can get that window back as it should be. The wires, you can see I've added wires at this end. Where they bridge over the top of the prism at this point, I'll fix them in place with a little bit of tape. Now there's already tape on that prism. I'm just going to put tape onto the tape. I'm not putting tape onto the surface of the prism itself, because that way lies madness and death. But let me have a go at this, see if I can get that window back looking as it should. That's not looking too promising. Well, that meter window looks an awful lot better. I wouldn't say it was perfect. It's certainly got some fairly deep pits in there where the solder had melted its way in, but it's far, far better than it was. And you may notice that I've changed the wire that I was using to something which is far more flexible. The stuff I had on there just wasn't really going to do the job, given the fragility of the connections that are going to be made up here on the cell. So that's the next thing to do. We need to connect that up to the cell and put the top on and have another go at testing the meter. Alright, top back on, meter working. I've set it so that it reads correctly on my light source, but of course that's only at one level. If the cell is somewhat tired, which they usually are, it might work right, it'll read accurately at that light level, but above or below those light levels it might be increasingly inaccurate. But the main thing is it's going. So I'm very pleased about that, and I'll carry on now, just closing up the top of this camera. I know I've got the screw for the end here. I've got this 2 screws for the other end, one behind the rewind knob there. The screw in the top was not the correct screw for this camera. It didn't fit it particularly well. I'll have to find one to do that job. And of course I've got to put the ring back on here and see if I can find some screws for it. But if I can't, I will put a little dab of adhesive under that and just clip it into place. Right, let's get some of these screws in the cover. Just check that I've got 3 here and that the 3 look the same. can't say they're particularly pretty looking screws. I suppose they're chrome plated. I'll hide that ugly one behind the rewind, behind the advance lever, I think. If I had shinier screws, I'd use them, but I don't. Turn the end of the housing here. The screws are chrome, look like the chrome's peeling off them, which suggests to me they were just poor manufacture. The viewfinder eyepiece, let's have a look at that. Fleck of dust on there, we can do without that. But no fingerprints. The eyepiece is clean. It's reluctant to start. I'll have to loosen the screws up. It may well be that the cover's been shifted enough that it doesn't want to line up. Yes. And the camera still functions. That's a bonus because you're never sure with things like this. Right, the rewind knob. The screw that goes in the end of the meter, that's here somewhere. That only leaves us with the collar and the missing screw. I'd better hunt up a screw. Well, I think I'll call it there. It's all finished, it's all back together, it's all working. The meter is accurate at the point I set it. Whether it remains accurate at other light levels is yet to be determined. Now, the meter adjustment. I got my rough meter adjustment correct by removing the meter, moving that little block that had the pin on it backwards or forwards one turn on the shaft, putting the pin back in. Then you get the fine adjustment. That'll take you a couple of stops either way as you move that one turn on the shaft. The fine adjustment, you remember that pin I said with the thread on it? And the pin appeared to be eccentric to the centre of the shaft. That was intentional. That's to give you extra adjustment. So that as you turn the pin, turn the screw, the pin is either shifting this way or that way. Well, as it happens, the small amount of eccentricity on that shaft was enough to make more than a stop difference in the setting of the meter. So this chrome screw you see here on the front plate, that's a cover screw. You take that screw off, you could see the head of that little screw underneath it. And you would adjust that to make your fine adjustment for your meter. So that's why that pin that I thought had just been poorly manufactured was intentional. It was intended to be eccentric so that you could adjust the meter. But anyway, I'm happy with the result here. This has come out well. If anything, this is a tidier example than the first one I had, my kit set one. So now I'm the proud owner of 2 Braun Paxette Reflex Automatics, and I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Who needs 2 of these? Thanks for watching.